Welcome to UC Science Radio, where we conduct interviews with a range of scientists to learn about the big issues facing our world and what science is doing to help. I'm Molly McGidd, a visiting Fulbright student at UC. Today, I'm talking with Dr. Simon Kingham. He's a professor in geography and the chief science advisor to the Ministry of Transport. He studies people and how we move around our towns and cities. The data he collects helps us understand how things like cycleways and parks influence our physical and mental health. Kia ora, Simon. I am curious about lots of things about your work, but primarily just what do you do? What is your role at the university and outside, and what's your research?
So I'm a professor in the School of Earth and Environment. I'm a geographer, a human geographer. So the things I'm interested in are anything, I guess, to do with the urban environment and the impacts the urban environment has on our well-being and our behaviour and our health. So as part of that, I direct a thing called the GeoHealth Laboratory, which does research for the Ministry of Health. We only do research for them that is of particular policy relevance. And so I guess that's a theme of the other research. So I've also done research on transport and well-being. And again, it tends to all be with end users. And I do that 3 days a week because at the moment I'm also seconded to the Ministry of Transport as their chief science advisor. So in normal times, I spend a couple of days a week in Wellington. And the role there is to ensure that policy is evidence-based. So I have lots of conversations with people. I'm asked to comment on policy documents, and I'm often asked to comment on the evidence base for those documents.
So when you say you work with end users, what exactly does that mean?
It's a range of people. So a lot of the projects I do will be with government, for instance. So they might be with central government, people in central government, so increasingly, obviously, through that role in the Ministry of Transport. But it's also with people at the city council, the regional council. So we might do a project where we're working on something that's of particular relevance and use to them. But it also goes down to a different level. So quite a few of the courses I teach actually involve students doing research projects with community groups. So there might be residents associations, some are private companies, some are other forms of NGOs. So, but a lot of them are actually resident associations. So it varies from resident associations up to central government.
What was your path to this research and to academia in general?
When I was at school, if I go way back to then, I was at a place called Lancaster in the north of England, which is quite a good university. And I met two people there who influenced me. One was one of my lecturers, a guy called John Whiteleg, who was a passionate transport advocate. And I remember one lecture that really stuck with me because he didn't turn up. And we wondered why this guy hadn't turned up to the lecture. And then it turns out, and I don't know if this was an urban myth, but I think it probably was partly true, is that he'd tied himself to a tree because someone was trying to chop it down and he didn't think it should be being chopped down because he was an absolute activist, an environmental activist. But he was passionate about transport and he used to talk about things that are very popular nowadays in terms of sustainable transport. But this is 30 odd years ago. So he was ahead of his time in that respect. And then I met another guy called Tony Gattrell. So that guy was a guy called John Whiteleg. And then I met a guy called Tony Gattrell who persuaded me to do a PhD. And he was really interested in health inequalities and geography of health. And I guess that got me into doing a PhD. And to some extent, I've never actually, in many ways, never actually made a hard decision to do what I'm doing. I've kind of fallen into things. But certainly those two people were people who really influenced my decision to do what I'm doing.
So to look at all your projects, they seem to me somewhat unrelated. So you've done things with air pollution and cycling, but also mental health after disasters and non-fluoride toothpaste use, all these things I've seen that you've done. And it's just made me wonder what connects them all.
Yep. So there's a couple of, I guess there is an overarching theme, and I guess the overarching theme is the impact of where we live on our health and well-being. And I would say that's the overall theme. And it generally, most of the research I do is urban, so it's about urban environment and well-being. But then the other part is, I think I'm a person who is less focused on a particular theoretical area and much more focused on taking opportunities. And so some of these opportunities have arisen because of research funding, for instance. So I used to do a lot of work on air pollution and well-being. And then the funding for that in New Zealand really disappeared. And so I've changed direction slightly according to funding. And then opportunities happen. So something will happen. So the earthquakes in Christchurch, you alluded to the mental health projects. The earthquakes happened. I managed to get some funding and employ a PhD student, and we did a project looking at mental health and geography after the earthquake. So an interesting thing about that project was, and this is where the geography comes in, that we know that a lot of people moved house in many cases a number of times after the earthquakes as they moved around, and therefore it was really important to be able to track people through time, because you couldn't just look at the address that they were at the time of the earthquakes or the address they were at the time that they were diagnosed with a mental health problem. You actually had to be able to track them through time, and that was where the geography came in. Really interesting project. I think it has real direct policy impact, but it was to some extent taking an opportunity. So I guess maybe that's one thing I've been quite good at, is seeing opportunities and thinking, well, that's kind of related to what I do. But you're absolutely right. My research is a little bit all over the place, but it's within that broad theme of urban environment and health and well-being.
Going back to that project you talked about, I was really interested in the mental health effects of the disaster and what happened here. So what did you find?
And what we found is that the address that you were at the time you're diagnosed, so often the way we look at the impact of the environment on well-being is we look at the address you're at when you intersect with a health service or you're surveyed or something. But actually in the context of that, we found that address location often was meaningless, because some of the most affected people by the earthquake actually ended up living in places that weren't particularly affected. So if you went back to where they lived, that you'd go, well, actually that place wasn't affected, but they got mental health problems. And so in this case, it was actually anxiety. So what we actually found is if you track them back, you could find that sometimes it was where they were at the time of the earthquake, which was a far better indicator of impact on life, but also the amount of times they'd moved and where they'd moved to and from. So we found that people immediately after the earthquake, if people stayed in their community, they seemed to do better because they kind of had that strength of community. So the people who stayed had that strength of community. They'd make jokes about the toilet not working and the houses being broken, and that was fine. Whereas the people who initially moved went into a new place, they had no social connection around them and they struggled. But you then go a year later and it changes round, because the people who've moved have started to establish themselves in new communities, but the people who have stayed where they are, suddenly it's not quite so fun. It's not quite so fun having your toilets broken after a year. It's not quite so fun when the shops nearby are closed because they got damaged in the earthquake. The school might have closed. A number of your community have moved away, and suddenly it's not quite so fun. And then there were also interesting things about people who went away and came back. So there was a whole range of things according to where people were and where they'd moved to. So basically what we found is that moves and where people are located to was often a much stronger determinant of impact on mental well-being than actually the address they were living at the time, which is the traditional way of looking at it.
It's really fascinating. So if there was no limit on the budget that you were given, what is the one thing that you would do to change the world or to fix a global problem? A big question.
I think some of the things we actually don't need unlimited budgets, actually. I mean, one of the things I'm passionate about is designing communities so that they are better for our health and well-being. So for instance, I think we know that people like living in neighborhoods that are green. They like living in neighborhoods where the traffic is slower and there's less of it. They like living in neighborhoods where they can walk to parks and where there are shops nearby. I think a lot of people actually don't particularly choose or enjoy driving long distances to places, but they do it because they don't have a choice. They actually, when you give people good public transport and you provide good infrastructure and good places for people to walk and cycle, they actually like doing that. At the moment, we're currently we're doing this as we're locked down, and I don't know what you're seeing, but what I'm seeing, I'm talking to a lot of other people. There's a lot of people out walking and cycling, and I suspect that part of the reason they're out walking and cycling is because there's very little traffic, and they actually quite enjoy it. So if we could create a society where we gave people those choices, we could actually see very different outcomes. I think we'd see better community. I think we'd see improved mental health and well-being. We'd see increased physical activity. And that, to some extent, that doesn't need money. It actually needs strong political will. It needs good evidence to demonstrate that the outcomes for that are good, which I think that there is, and maybe there needs to be a bit more research. But I think to some extent, it's those things which may not be dramatically expensive. Perhaps they need strong political will. We also know there are, in many places in the world, there are strong vested interests in keeping the status quo. So we know historically, car companies, for instance, going back 50, 60 years, have managed to change laws to make it less attractive to walk. Well, is that sort of stuff happening, and what can we do to change some of those sorts of things? So we don't need lots of money. We need political will, and we need a different mindset and different thinking.
Yes, I saw a lot of your work had to do with cycleways and putting those into Christchurch itself. And I've only been living here for a few months, so I don't know what it looked like before now, which for me, it feels very safe to be able to cycle around and have these paths to go on. But I'm curious about what sort of transformation happened to create that infrastructure and what the process was like of convincing people that this was a good thing to do and that the city should implement it.
Yes, that's interesting. So if you come, certainly to some extent, the earthquakes were the tipping point and the change, because there's been a lot of infrastructure change and investment. And so the major cycleways are part of that. So we now have this program of 13 major cycleways and some infrastructure in other places. But when I came here in the early 2000s, the policy at the time was that we had painted cycleways. So we'd paint a very small strip at the side and call it a cycleway. My thoughts of what the evidence was telling us is that that's not going to help. It's actually probably just a bit of a waste of paint, to be honest. But I was told at the time on numerous occasions that all we had to do was wait till the network was complete. So once we had lots of painted cycleways, people would start cycling. And I just didn't believe it, because I thought this is not going to make people who are not cycling feel safer. It might help the very small number of existing cyclists. So actually, I mean, we were talking earlier about how I got into research. So I managed to get some funding back in 2009, and with a colleague, an engineer, and so I'm a geographer, he's an engineer. We had a study looking at what was stopping people cycling in Christchurch. And the very clear outcome was people didn't feel safe, surprisingly, which we kind of knew, but we had to do the research to show it. But the really interesting thing was that people said what they absolutely needed was to be physically separated from traffic. To feel safe, they needed to be away from traffic. And so we showed them lots of examples of infrastructure, and we came out with the preferred forms of infrastructure. And this was done for the New Zealand Transport Agency, for the government. We told the city council about it. And then subsequently, and I don't know how direct the influence was, but clearly, as a result of that, post-earthquake, Christchurch now has a policy of that you have to build separated cycleways. And if all around the country, there's now an acceptance. And I think our research might have helped, but there was other things as well. And so now we have separated cycleways. There's still some bike clash. So we know there's a thing called bike clash, that people argue against it, and they get very protective about road space, and they don't like giving any to cycleways. But we're now seeing a very different city to the city of 15 years ago. So if you come 15 years ago, there would have been maybe one separated cycleway in the whole of the city, and now there's a network of them, some being built and some being built as we speak.
So the physical infrastructure has changed. What about people's behaviors? Are there more people who are biking?
Yeah, the council have cycle counters out, and there's evidence that the number of people biking is increasing dramatically, and we would expect it to. And again, this is exactly what the research tells us. So there's a mantra called "Build it and they will come." And it's come out of Portland originally in the US. One of the cycle planners there really pushed that phrase, and he said, actually, if you just build small amounts of cycleway, you'll increase more people. There isn't a point you have to reach. There's no tipping point. It basically, as you put more cycleways in, more people cycle. Because people cycle in the area where the cycleways are, so we need to keep doing them. And we're starting to see that happen, and we're transforming the city. And of course, in Central City now, we have reduced traffic speeds, which helps as well. We're having shared spaces and all sorts of other things, which are, they're evidence-based policy, which is great to see, because we are seeing a change in the way people are traveling.
So what sort of policy recommendations and things do you work on with the Ministry of Transport?
So in the ministry, I guess one thing I'm working on at the moment, I'll give one example. At the moment, the way we raise revenue to maintain our transport infrastructure is a lot of it's through a thing called road user charges or petrol tax. So when you buy your petrol, about 70 cents of it's tax. And if you have a diesel vehicle, you pay a thing called road user charges. So it works out the same amount of money, the same cost, but a slightly different way of collecting it. And what people are thinking about in the future is we might change the way we do that. So we could collect it all electronically. So you'd collect it, you'd have some sort of box or something in your vehicle, which is what a number of trucks do at the moment. And when